Welcome. I'm going to talk through a quick section on learning outcome 3, which is the cardiovascular system. I'll go through this section here. We're working particularly on this element. So P1M1, which is going to be part of a wider assignment, which includes all of those. To include P6, P7, M2, M3, M4, and D2. So this is a very quick presentation, relatively quick, that's describing the structure and function of the cardiovascular system and explaining the function of the cardiovascular system. So no distinctions on offer here, but I'm really looking for you to kind of start sort of piecing the structures together with their functions. So when it comes to your explanations, you might explain why a blood vessel is sort of made the way it is and how it affects what it does in the body. So there's some keywords here. These are all words that are going to be referenced in your assignment, so I will address a lot of these as we work through the presentation, but when it comes to your assignment, this is a good reference point to make sure you've included all of these words and given them a very brief description or shown them in the context of how they work in the cardiovascular system. So the aims of the presentation, we're working on part 1 today. So it's to talk about general circulation, distinction between pulmonary and systemic circulation. We'll look at blood vessels, how they differ in change in diameter, the width, and the heart and the importance of valves. The next presentation we'll go on to talk about the functions of the blood, and that will kind of show that section on explain the functions of the cardiovascular system, particularly with respect to the delivery of nutrients, the removal of waste, how it regulates our temperature, so the thermoregulation, and also how it transports oxygen and fights infection. So the role of the red blood cells in sort of transporting oxygen, and white blood cells in fighting infection. You could also look at platelets in terms of how they act in clotting. So what I've got here, you've got this in your sort of accompanying handbook. I'm going to get you to colour it in a minute. I'm just going to sort of kick it off to start with. You'll see on this this area I've done in blue. What I want is for you to begin by just colouring in. Can you see how from the lower limb, I'm just colouring it in as we talk, this sort of deoxygenated blood is returning towards the heart. Here the pelvis, here the gastrointestinal tract, your digestive system, here now the thoracic cavity, and it all, here I'm just going to colour in from the top, so from the head, the brain, and it all returns. I'll put a big arrow in green so as not to confuse, into the, oh, that's blue, there we go, into this right atrium. Now I'm just gonna, I'll use the fat sort of marker, so it'll probably go over the edges, but I want you to sort of see how this is working. So can you see how now I'm just taking that deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and so that's going either side, so it's pumping up deoxygenated blood now to this side of the lung. So what's going to happen here, and this is how I want your diagrams to look, you should have a nice sort of deoxygenated bit on one half of the lung, and as blood is oxygenated, the change in the hemoglobin causes it to look red, and so as, can you see on that side here, I'm just colouring in that red, and so when it's returning, it's just now oxygenated, and if you just follow my path, it's now coming here into that left atrium. So I'm going to draw a big arrow in red towards the left atrium. I'll put L. Look at that. Wonderful. Sorry, this is the left ventricle, should I say. So the left atrium feeds down into the left ventricle. There we go. That looks professional, doesn't it? So these all tip into the left ventricle, left atrium, sorry, and then the left ventricle. Can you see this following round? Now that is now all the way down out of the aorta, and do you see here now at the top I've got oxygenated blood going into my thoracic cavity. I've got oxygenated blood going towards the liver. I've got oxygenated blood going into the gastrointestinal tract. I've got oxygenated blood going into the pelvis. I've got oxygenated blood now going all the way to the lower limb, and up top some of these ascending arteries have given oxygenated blood to the head, the neck and the brain. So you end up, mine's a mess, but you can get the idea that we have this circulation at the top, which was about taking deoxygenated blood from the body, pumping it from the right ventricle into the lungs, and then returning it to the heart oxygenated. So that's called the pulmonary circulation. So the second bit of circulation is what's called the systemic circulation. So the systemic circulation goes from the left ventricle, and that you can see pumps that oxygenated red blood to all those organs and muscles of the lower limb and parts of the upper body. And so it's that oxygenation and return of that deoxygenated blood is called the systemic circulation. So the pulmonary circulation is concerned with oxygenating the blood, and the systemic circulation is concerned with delivering that oxygenated blood to the body's tissues and bringing it back to the heart. So this is a nice picture. I sort of cover over a little bit in the bottom right, but this is just a sort of slight different picture. What I'd like you to do, actually, I just want you to pause the presentation. I just want you to answer those 4 questions. The answers are all in the in this picture, which I think is a really nice, clear one. You may wish to refer to your previous scheme of circulation as well. So there's 4 questions on the right hand side. I just want you to pause the presentation and return in a second. Okay. So hopefully you've figured them out. The difference between pulmonary and systemic circulation I explained previously. In this picture, the pulmonary circulation is really the bit above here. So it's concerned with oxygenating the blood, and the systemic circulation is all this, which is about delivering that blood to the body. Now, the major artery exiting the left ventricle to supply systemic circulation. So you should have looked at this little fella here. So this is the aorta, a major artery. So in our heart it actually sort of almost kind of curves around the back, but there's branches that go up into the head. A really big sort of thick muscular wall, or thick fibrous and elastic wall, carries blood at really high pressure. And number 3 is what's the name of the major vein that empties into the right atrium. This was really important. This is just a nice term, actually. I'll put it in blue as I come up here. So you can see this vein here, the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. These are taking deoxygenated blood that's coming in this way from the body and is coming this way from the head and neck, and they both join together to tip it back into here which is the right atrium. So the vena cava is the name of the pair together. The superior vena cava brings back from the head, neck, and I think right arm, and the inferior vena cava brings it back from everywhere below. And here, I just wanted you to sort of get a feel for the fact that different blood vessels supply different parts of the body, and also to consider circulation as being something that supplies our organs as well. So I asked the major artery which supplies the liver. So you should, I'll just do a little orange down here. Should have found the liver down here, and here we've got the hepatic artery. So it's quite interesting actually. You can see here the digestive tract is supplied first by that oxygenated blood. So it kind of goes through where it will pick up your sort of nutrients received from your food, and then it takes it past the liver to process and sort of take out what it needs and get rid of what it doesn't. And then that deoxygenated blood is sort of brought back into that systemic sort of venous system via that inferior vena cava. So I really like these pictures. I think they show the scheme of circulation very nicely. For you, the main thing is this, that you have a very clear definition of pulmonary and systemic circulation, and that you can get that across in your assignments. So now you're moving on to blood vessels. Again, this is a little bit of a pause where you do your colouring in. If I can just sort of guide you a little bit in terms of the order, what I would strongly recommend is take a very light colour for the sort of epithelial tissue. So what we have here is your endothelium. I would colour only sort of three things here. Colour the endothelium, and what I suggest is you're going to need a bit more close control than I've got. Actually, I'll do. So capillaries are made of this endothelial tissue, so it's a very thin, it's a single cell thick. So you can see the capillary I'm just doing here. So take a nice light colour like my yellow and do that. So capillaries are where gas exchange happens. They have to be single cell thick, and they can allow a little bit of leakage of fluid actually. Hence why in veins and arteries we have these coverings to make sure they don't leak. But the important thing is they're very thin to allow gas to almost move out by diffusion, so they go through the wall. Now what's quite interesting is that endothelium is continuous throughout the system. So here I'm colouring in a vein. You can see there's a slight weird structure to it. That's actually a valve that you'll look at later. But also I've got, now we go to an artery, and I'm just colouring in the endothelium there. So you can see that the endothelium lines arteries, veins, and it kind of is the capillary. So you'll take your nice colouring in skills, and you'll also make sure you colour in the endothelium that's lining the vein here. I'm struggling here, but also the middle of that artery. Now the next thing I need you to do, take another sort of fairly neutral colour, and I want you to just colour, oh, I end up with that same one. There we go. Come on, we got this. There we go. Smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is F. So here let's try the artery first. So can you see here F? Smooth muscle. There we go. So smooth muscle is covering a chunk of the artery. So I want you to colour that in nicely. Here's where my colouring skills are going to fail me. So you can see on the artery here we've got this pretty thick chunk of smooth muscle, and on the vein we still have it, but not quite so thick. I then want you to take another sort of fairly neutral colour, take a purple maybe, and I want you to colour this fibrous tissue on the outside. Oh, there we go. So you can see in a vein it's all here, so I want you to complete that, and in an artery you complete that. There we go. So you get the idea. If you get time, maybe just put in the elastic lamina as well. So what you should have is a nice sort of picture of the different layers of those blood vessels and the relative contribution of smooth muscle and elastic tissue. So if I can just pause you whilst you complete that, then I'll go to the next slide and discuss it in a bit more depth. So hopefully you finished your pictures nicely. I thought this one was quite a useful one just to add in. Just when you look at that capillary, here you can see on the, if I just sort of draw your attention, here, can you see on the left hand side, I've got, it's almost like what's called a capillary bed. So sort of arteries will gradually sort of fan out into these capillary beds. So I've got, coming in from here is my arterial blood flow, and then blood just sort of nourished tissues. It just needs to almost kind of fan out. There's never a point in your body where a cell is more than almost like, say, 2 millimeters away from a capillary, maybe even less than that actually. So to get there, these capillaries have to branch and branch, and once they're here, really the gases are able to just leak out or diffuse out into the surrounding tissues. So as that happens, the blood then sort of begins to recollect, and it finds its way into these venules to be returned to the sort of central circulation. So on this right hand side, what it's got here, it talks about these precapillary sphincters. So there are times when we want to alter blood flow. So here what you see is you have that sort of larger little artery, this one, this one here, and can you see how as that blood flows into that middle sort of artery, it's chosen not to go into the ones either side of it, which sort of remain white, and that's because blood vessels have constricted. So why it might want to do that, I guess have a think about why a body might want to restrict blood flow. And maybe it's about, you could look at, say, an injury where there's some bleeding and the blood vessel constricts to limit blood flow to an area. Or you could look at something like when we're exercising, and as we exercise, we don't have so much demand for oxygenated blood from, say, our digestive system, so the body's able to shut that down and make it available to those working muscles. Here's a nice picture. That picture on the right hand side you should start to kind of recognise from your own colouring in, really. You can see that big artery, and there's that little table that sort of shows the differing amount of smooth muscle. So you can see in an artery there's quite a lot of smooth muscle. So that sort of constricting is quite an important role that they play. I'll show you that in action in a minute. So that smooth muscle lines that blood vessel. And can you see the next layer down? So arteries feed in to smaller arterioles, so they take a little bit of the pressure out. And can you see the differing smooth muscles? So there's still a bit there, and I don't know if you can just make out that slightly different arrangement of it. I'm just colouring it in green here. That it almost sort of seems to wrap around a slightly different way. So there's a bit more scope for them to kind of just block off blood flow to particular areas. The picture below shows the capillary, so you can see it's just made of that endothelium here. So single cell thick to allow gas exchange, so it allows oxygen to transfer from red blood cells which remain within the capillary, and the gas diffuses out into the body's tissues where it's needed most. And then you can start to see the veins, so the venules, and then the veins collect blood and go back to the heart. Now, one of the things is if blood leaving the heart is under really high pressure, so if it reached a capillary under that same pressure, it would burst. So blood, by the time it gets to a capillary, is under actually fairly low pressure, which means the veins are returning blood to the heart under quite low pressure. So there's no sort of secondary heart to sort of really drive it back into the heart. So they require a system of valves. So what you can see here, can you see where I'm just colouring in green? There's a little valve, kind of like that shape. And so what it means is that blood is travelling in that direction as it goes up. So what happens is the muscle squeezes the blood vessel. It causes blood to pump up or squeeze up, and then as it tries to drop down, the valve shuts, the blood squeezed again, blood moves up, and as it tries to drop down, that valve closes again. So this, what's called a skeletal muscle pump, is how veins, the valves in veins, act to help stop that return of blood and that pooling of blood in the extremities. So here on the right hand side, I've just got a little graphic that shows how blood flow is changed at different parts of the body when we exercise. I showed this in a previous presentation actually. So the thing to draw your attention to, I'll just colour it in green here. This is cardiac output at rest. Okay, so this bit green. So this, as you rest, your cardiac output is determined by your stroke volume, i.e. how much blood is ejected from the heart with each beat, and your heart rate. So a normal stroke volume is somewhere, I don't know, 80 millilitres, and a normal heart rate somewhere around 70, for example. So as you start exercising, your heart rate obviously is going to increase, but also your stroke volume, maybe, I don't know, increase to 50%. So it's quite interesting to see that this sort of average person, their cardiac output during vigorous exercise goes up almost, I guess, about 4 or 5 times, up to around just under 26 litres. But what's quite interesting is the percentage difference, particularly when you look at skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle has 21% of your blood, of not very much blood actually, at rest. But when you're exercising, it has 88% of quite a lot more blood that's circulating. So that's quite a dramatic difference. And to allow that availability of blood, we need to start limiting blood flow to other areas to make sure it's available for the rest of the body. So what's quite interesting, and I think you need to mention this in your assignments, is that at rest, 24% goes to your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive system. But when we're exercising, it goes down to 1. Your kidneys at rest, 19%, and when you're exercising, it goes down to 1. So this is quite an important point, that we need that downtime to allow our kidneys, digestive system to do their functions, to do their filtering, to do their processing, do their digestion. But when we're exercising, our body's priority is our working muscles. So the action of movement dilates blood vessels, so the smooth muscles in arteries and arterioles relaxes to allow blood into those working muscles, whereas it constricts to limit blood flow into those areas such as the kidneys and the digestive system, to allow that sort of shutting down to allow availability of blood for the rest of the body. So we call that vasodilation when they get wider, and vasoconstriction when they get smaller. So I want you to spend a minute just working on those questions on the left hand side, and then I'll sort of review them very quickly in a second. Okay, so hopefully you paused the presentation. The blood vessels that have the thickest walls with the most elastic tissue are going to be the arteries, so they're under much greater pressure. So when the heart contracts, they need to maybe just have a little bit of expansion and just give. It's not a pumping, but it's just that ability to have that just sort of elastic sort of expansion and then that little recoil. So the why is really, it's about them being under such great pressure. And also when that heart beats, you don't want a sort of intermittent flow. You want the heart rate to expand, and as it sort of recoils, just adds a little squeeze, re-expand, recoil, little squeeze, and that helps that flow just sort of normalize and become quite regular. What do veins have to help blood return to the heart under their low pressure? Well, you should have mentioned the valves, the fact that the muscles squeeze those valves, causing blood to shoot up. So a failure of those valves in something like a varicose vein causes blood to almost kind of pool at the bottom of the vein. It gets them baggy and quite prone to sort of inflammation. And why are capillaries only one cell thick? Well, that's really to allow that gas exchange and to allow nutrients to pass from the blood into the tissues. So lastly, we get onto the heart. On the left hand side, I've got a little picture. I'm just going to sort of sully it with my green marker again. You can see here where the heart sits in the chest, just slightly to the left of the lungs. So it sort of uses a little bit of that left lung space. In front of the lungs, just slightly. You can see that in that sort of bottom picture here. Just behind the sternum. And you sort of say about the sort of fist size, just to the left of the heart. Sorry, left of the chest. So what I'm asking you to do, there's quite a complex diagram of the heart here. I'm gonna sort of kick you off or start it off. I want you to go away and colour your version, and then I'm gonna recap the rest of the presentation. So what I'd like you to do to begin with, I want you to sort of orientate yourself in by just taking a sort of blue colour to represent deoxygenated blood, and what I'd like you to do is just colour in the right ventricle, if I may. So you're going to colour in C, and can you see how that's all the way down here? What I recommend, actually, just so let's save the use of excessive pens, be careful down here because there's a structure that I want you to include. I might not be able to make it quite as delicate as you can because I'm doing it with my computer's mouse. So colour in the deoxygenated blood in the right ventricle blue, but also maybe you can just take a slight, I'll use a slightly darker blue. If you don't have access to different shades of blue like I have, then just colour all of that pulmonary artery blue. I know there's different sections, ask you to do an A1, A2, but just colour that all blue to illustrate that that's going to the lung to be oxygenated. So you can start to see this just sort of gradually taking shape. What's going to happen is you're going to get oxygenated blood, and can you just see how in the left atrium, I'll leave the left atrium, should I leave it? No, I then want you to, so what's going to happen is that blue blood is going to be oxygenated. It's going to return oxygenated to here, which is a left atrium. So maybe you can choose a sort of reddish or a pinkish colour. It's then going to be pumped through into this left ventricle that I'm just trying to colour here, this J. So have a nice bold red for whatever you use for that left ventricle, because I want you to then leave out that valve in G, and I want you to show that oxygenated nice red blood curling up out of the aorta, and look how it just dips down the back of the heart, and now just kind of colouring where it ends up down the back. Up top, these arteries go up to our head and neck and up to the arms. But what I really want you to do, once you've orientated yourself in with that right ventricle and left ventricle and the vena cava and the aorta, I want you to now colour in the valves. So I'll just put the green. So what I want you to concentrate on is this. I want you to colour in valve. Here I've just coloured in green. You choose a colour. I want to colour this one, the AV tricuspid valve. I want to colour in this one. Oh, there we go. Pulmonary semilunar valve, that's his G. And I want you to colour in this one, the aortic semilunar valve. So 4 valves. You could even just colour them the same sort of colour, but make them really bright, make them really stand out, because you're going to get a couple of questions on what they do. I'm going to leave you to do that. I want you to pause the presentation, and then I'm going to review them in a slide over. So this is just a nice sort of picture of the heart at different levels. So you can see a picture on the left hand side is sort of slightly blown up, and then we've cut it in half to sort of expose the sort of valves and the workings inside. You can see that aorta up the top again, so the left ventricle is pumping up, and that's quite an important point when you think about the value of valves, is that the valves have to allow blood to enter the heart from the top, but when it pumps it also kind of exits the heart from the top. So the valves become really important. So what we see here is the heart. Now I'm going to just quickly talk you through, and then I'm going to get you to answer a couple of questions on the left hand side. So let's again just start from our right atrium. So you can see, think about where the right atrium receives its blood. You should have identified the vena cava superior from above and the vena cava inferior from below. So here I've got blood returning to the right atrium. Okay, I've just popped it in green so you can sort of follow me. Now that, I'll try and get it across here. So if we can imagine the right atrium constricts, so the right atrium contracts, and there's a wave of contraction, begins at the right atrium and then goes on to the left atrium. So we get a sort of squeezing of blood down into those ventricles. So as it squeezes down, blood is passed from the right atrium to the right ventricle and the left atrium to the left ventricle. Then there's a very brief pause in the heart. When we listen to heartbeats with a stethoscope, that do-do, do-do, what you hear is actually valves opening and shutting. So here, as those arteries are squeezed down, they squeeze blood from the atria into the ventricles, and now the ventricles have to contract very quickly. Now, to stop backflow into the atria, we have 2 valves. On the right side of the heart, we have a tricuspid valve, which is sort of got 3 kind of leaves. You can look up the structure. And and that prevents blood flowing back into that right atrium. So as it's passed through, when the right ventricle contracts, that valve closes to prevent that backflow. On the right hand side, we've got a bicuspid valve preventing backflow from the right ventricle, sorry, the left ventricle into the left atrium. So, as blood exits the right ventricle up into the pulmonary artery, that right ventricle is then going to relax. Now, any backflow into that right ventricle here is going to be quite problematic. So to help, we have what's called a semilunar valve. So it's sort of shaped by, the valve looks a bit like two sort of half moons joined together. So when blood gets powered through that from that right ventricle up into the right artery, the pulmonary artery, to prevent backflow, that valve closes, and when blood comes from the right ventricle again, it just opens, and when that ventricle relaxes, it just closes. We have a similar arrangement between the left ventricle and the aorta. So we have an aortic valve, which means that when that left ventricle contracts, it opens up and allows blood to flow into the aorta, but when that left ventricle relaxes, that valve closes to prevent that backflow. So I want you to take a minute to answer the questions on the left-hand side, and I just want you to sort of pause the presentation and work your way through those questions. Just have a look on the diagram where you see these different valves happening. You may also need to go back to your previous picture. So you're looking at which valve prevents backflow to the right atrium when the right ventricle contracts. I may have coloured it in orange. I want you to look at which valve prevents backflow into the left atrium when the left ventricle contracts. So again, I may have coloured that in orange. I want you to answer the question. So if the pulmonary semilunar valve, so think about which side of circulation that's on, the pulmonary semilunar valve was dysfunctional, so the valve was leaking, maybe one of the cusps was damaged, what effect would it have on blood leaving the heart? And lastly, if the aortic semilunar valve wasn't working, what would happen to blood flow? So just pause the presentation. I'll just go through the last two. Okay, so the first two questions should have been straightforward. The right tricuspid valve between the atrium and ventricle, and then the left bicuspid valve between the atrium and ventricle. Question 3 maybe not so easy. So I'm asking if the pulmonary semilunar valve, so this is the one between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, was dysfunctional, what effect would it have on blood leaving the heart? Well, it wouldn't be able to leave fully, would it? So what you'd get is you'd get the ventricle contracting, but there'd be a bit of blood sort of trickling back into it. So it's almost like as if the ventricle would fill too early. It would always be pumping, but it'd always be that little bit of dribbling back into the heart. So it would mean the body would struggle to oxygenate enough blood to supply the body, and certainly when we started raising our levels of exercise intensity, the heart would have to beat that much faster to drive enough blood round to the body to allow that oxygenation. Similar thing with the question 4, if the aortic semilunar valve was working, what would happen to the blood flow? Well, exactly the same. There just wouldn't be enough blood. There would be constant dribbling back from that aorta into that left ventricle. So the left ventricle would be be again having to work much harder. The body would be crying out for oxygen, so it would just increase that flow, and it would struggle to clear enough blood. A kind of knock on of that could be if the left ventricle is really struggling to clear the blood because there's this sort of backflow from the aorta, it means that the atrium is almost going to then get sort of that sort of logjam. So if you then think where that left atrium is getting its blood from, it's getting its blood from the lungs. So possibly, well, often what you'll see is that the heart has to work harder to try and clear that backlog, but the more it struggles, the more that blood builds up in the capillaries of the lungs, and you get that sort of leakage of fluid out into the lungs, and you get almost sort of blood and like a very frothy sort of kind of coughy, gurgly sounds in the lung. So heart failure can often manifest or be shown by these sort of very kind of awkward respiratory symptoms. So I hope that has outlined a few bits and pieces. It's probably longer than I thought, but there's a lot to get through, and I don't mind if you did this in a couple of sittings, as long as you did your colouring in. So now really it's your opportunity to review work from your course book, what we've just been through, and I want you to review these questions before completing your workbook and before attempting an assignment, because what you should be doing is in your assignments you should almost be answering these questions for me. I want the reader to be able to know or have these questions answered so that they've got a really full understanding and you can have explained all of these concepts. So I'm not going to review these at the end, but we'll review them in class and I'll check that you've included them. So they should be fairly straightforward. I want you to begin with by trying the questions without reference to any book actually. So have 10 minutes to just work through, see if you can do them, and then grab a book and fill in any answers, and then we'll review them as a class. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that's been of some use.